Today I am pleased to welcome Jonathan Orr-Stav, who will present a talk on Arabic Hebrew, How Modern Israelis Really Speak. Jonathan is a recognized local author, translator, and editor. He's known as a compelling speaker who blends humor with his extensive knowledge of the Hebrew language. He's the son and grandson of noted Israeli translators and editors, and he maintains that family tradition to this day. He's the author of Aleph Through the Looking Glass, Learning to Write Hebrew Script. And he's lauded for making the Hebrew script more accessible to non-Hebrew speakers. He's also written best-selling books on computer-aided design, and he's a former technical writer in the Israeli high-tech sector. He has an abiding passion for facilitating clear and compelling communication of ideas in writing, for the history of the Hebrew script, and for computer applications in Hebrew. Jonathan was raised in Israel, London, and New York, and has lived with his family in Victoria since 2002. And we're so happy to have him here. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Orr-Stav.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marilyn, and thanks to everyone for coming. I have to say I'm surprised at how many people are interested. I gave this talk actually 3 years ago at the synagogue, and a much smaller number turned up. So I'm glad to see that people are taking advantage of Zoom to be able to attend the second talk. What I'm going to do, I'm going to start sharing my screen, so you won't see my mug anymore at this point. What I'm about to tell you or describe to you is something which, for some reason, hasn't been talked about a great deal in Israel's, modern Israel's short history, which is the type of Hebrew that people actually speak in day-to-day life is not the Hebrew that you'll see in textbooks and even in many talks or books about Israel. I know that the title of this series is about bridges, building bridges between communities. But as I pointed out to Marilyn when she talked to me about that, it's not so much like a bridge as a natural occurrence. It's, if you know this, the Mont Saint-Michel in France, at high tide, it's cut off from the mainland, but at low tide, you suddenly have this land bridge between the two. And what's going on with Israel today is a bit like that, in the sense that there's a trend which really can't be stopped. It's not intentional. It's a natural occurrence, much as Canute couldn't stop the waters, and Florida can't stop global climate change from inundating it within 50 years. You can't fight the rising waters. And there's a similar situation happening in Hebrew. And although it's not acknowledged in most Hebrew books that you'll find on the market today, it is a fact of life. Now, it's part of a wider phenomenon of Hebrew as seen by others. The general impression that people have outside Israel is that when any two Israelis meet, they say shalom to each other. You'll see that in films, you'll see that in books and so forth. But in reality, if someone were to say shalom to another guy, the other guy would say, are you feeling okay? It's not something that one actually does most of the time when two Israelis meet. It's a bit like Indians in the 1950s in the States, who were always shown as saying how. In reality, when two Israelis meet, they usually say ahlan, which is Arabic, meaning welcome, but we use it in the sense of just hello. Now, there's a certain demographic to all of these terms, and I'll be talking about this a little more, but this is something pretty universal. This covers pretty much all ages and all communities. It comes from the Arabic ahlan wa sahlan, and we just use the actual ahlan part of it. There are only 3 occasions when Israelis typically say shalom to each other. One is in official first-time meetings where they say shalom, name Lord, one to each other. The other is when grandparents are receiving or welcoming their grandchildren. They say shalom, it's kind of very kind of theatrical kind of greeting. And the third type is a similar theatrical greeting once you see an old friend that you haven't seen for a long time, in which case they say shalom. So that's the third type of situation. Otherwise, Israelis generally don't say shalom to each other. The other thing to bear in mind in what I'm about to describe to you is that the terms that you're about to see are not always true Arabic. In some cases, the original, the literal meaning was not understood or is misunderstood, the conjugation is lost, and sometimes the meaning is actually changed. In that respect, it's a bit like the way we use French in English. So some terms are the same, like apropos, femme fatale, je ne sais quoi, and so on, but some are not the same, like entrée, gourmand, journal, gauche, and bijou, in which in English we use in slightly different meanings than the original French. Now, people in Israel are generally aware of, obviously, of the resemblance or the relationship between the two languages. They know that wahad in Arabic is echad, in Hebrew, walad is yeled, ab is av, and so on. But there are lots of words which actually most Israelis aren't aware. So, for example, all the Jewish months are actually pretty much the same as in Arabic. Like Shvat is actually Shvat, Adar, Nisan, Iyar, and so on. Very similar and sometimes identical to the Arabic names. Now, what's been going on in Israel for the last 130 years is a process. In the late 19th century, there were only about 25,000 Jews in Palestine, 400,000 Arabs. Most Jews looked like this. They were what we call part of the Yishuv Yashan, the old settlement. And these are Jewish communities that lived in four specific cities, typically Jerusalem, Hebron, Tzfat, and Tiberias, known as the four holy cities. So they dressed like this. The ones that you see on the right are actually Ashkenazi. The guy on the left is a Sephardi. But what they all had in common is they all spoke Arabic because you had to. Everyone there was actually the milieu was Arabic speaking. So when Eliezer ben Yehuda, who is generally credited as being the reviver of the Hebrew language, when his son was born, he named him Itamar, or actually Ben Zion, and they insisted on making sure that Itamar would be entirely Hebrew speaking. So poor little child, they actually cut him off from the natural environment for about 5 years and spoke to him exclusively in Hebrew. And so he became the first native Hebrew speaking child. But surrounding him, everyone spoke Arabic except for some Orthodox people who spoke some Yiddish at home as well. So if you were to look at the situation at the beginning of the old, say the beginning of the Zionist enterprise in 1882, pretty much 100% of Jews spoke Arabic. But this began to go down in the years, in the first 25 or 30 years of Zionism, because you had Zionist settlers coming in from Russia and Eastern Europe who had to learn Arabic, and in many cases didn't. And they were learning Hebrew in particular. And once Hebrew became entrenched as the native language for Jews in Palestine, the percentage of Arabic-speaking Jews plummeted further and further, so that by the start of the state of Israel, you had only about, 10% or so who actually spoke Hebrew in any sort of, with any kind of, Arabic, with any kind of fluency. And then in the last generation or so, there was a slight increase, and that's because of security reasons. They had to, local Jews in some cases had to learn Arabic in order to be able to defend themselves more successfully. And then after the state was established, the percentage went down again, and it's carried on going down to this day. Now these figures are taken from the Vanier Institute. So the first Jews who started reviving the knowledge of Arabic were actually the Palmach, the paramilitary Jewish organization in the 20, 30 years before the state was established. They had to learn Arabic in order to perform their operations in the field, and it became a kind of in-crowd thing that if you were in the Palmach, then you learned a whole host of Arabic words, which this is just a selection of them. And a lot of these words, most Israelis, in fact, wouldn't even know. I know that my mother, for example, used to say yabaye a lot, and she's bat, and I had no idea, and most Israelis don't know that actually this is from Arabic as well. Over time, once the state was established, some of these words disappeared from the general vocabulary, but what you see here are words that we still use today. And I'll be explaining most of these in the course of this lecture. Now, as I was mentioning before, every word has its own demographic in terms of ages and in terms of whether it's Ashkenazi or Mizrahi, the community that's of the person who's speaking. For the purposes of understanding what kind of language everybody uses, I would say that it's important to understand that there are four basic types. There's what I would call almost everyone, which is pretty much everyone from the age of 10 onwards. The group that I would call marriage plus, which is people with children. And then there's what I would call the young and the restless. And finally, what I would call this dude talk. So only young men, typically, of a particular background. Now, a word on the question of Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, because I've been called out on this as to, is this really going on? Is it really about Ashkenazi versus Mizrahi? Is it not simply white collar versus blue collar? But it isn't, in fact. It's slightly more grained. If you were to go into it a little bit more closely, you'll see that actually there are, today in modern Israel, there are no fewer than 13 different distinct tribes. Now that's the subject of a different talk of mine, and we can do this on other occasions. But broadly speaking, you have the Ashkenazi communities, which include the Ashkenazi secular, the religious nationalist, ultra-Orthodox Russians, as we call them, and oddly enough, the pure Sephardi, who are considered honorary Ashkenazi because they're very much part of the establishment. But those are the Sephardi Jews who were already in Jerusalem, mostly Jerusalem, at the time when the Zionism, first Zionists arrived, and they're considered pretty much like the aristocracy of the country. People like Yitzhak Navon, those people are pure Sephardi, and they're very much part of the establishment. Then you have the so-called Mizrahi, which includes the pure Sephardi nominally, but it also includes the North African Jews from Morocco, Libya, and so forth, Tunisia, and Iraqi, Persians, and Yemenites. Then, of course, you have the Arabic-speaking communities, which are Druze, urban Arabs, rural Arabs, Bedouin Arabs, and these are very distinct communities. And when I say distinct communities, I mean not just in terms of language they use, because the language of each of these is slightly different, but also in terms of who marries whom. Where do you have intermarriages between? And then you have Ethiopians as well, who are kind of integrating within the broader society. Now, as I was mentioning, there are intermarriages between the communities. This is my own gang from the army that we did the army together. This is the picture we took in the Sinai just before we got drafted. Within this group, we were sort of half Ashkenazi, half Mizrahi, Sephardi. And what's interesting is that what's happened with us pretty much happened with the rest of the country. You began to have intermarriages, as it were, between Mizrahi and Sephardi and Ashkenazi, one of each. And it's remarkable that all the couples that formed were exactly like that. There's Renee and myself, by the way. We were the last couple to form. And then you had others who also married people from the other community, but not within the group. That's the group 10 years ago when we had a reunion and when we turned 50. So, talking about demographics, let's talk about the terms that are used by pretty much everyone. So, this covers pretty much the entire population from the age of 10 to 90 or whatever. So we have ahbal. Ahbal, which in Arabic and in Hebrew means an idiot or an imbecile. The example is al ta'mud sham kama ahbal, don't stand there like an idiot. That's a very common word. Then you have, and that's pretty much for everyone. Then you have a word like hafla, which in Arabic actually means party, but in Hebrew we've adopted it to mean a feast or a celebratory get-together with food. So people saying "Achanichim pal shulam dbach," that's the hafla. The cadets invaded the kitchen and had a feast there. That's pretty typical. And again, it's something which pretty much everyone says. Tembel. Tembel is another word for an idiot or someone stupid. In Arabic, it's actually stupid and lazy, and it's actually tanbal. But in Hebrew, we've corrupted it slightly, and it means an idiot. So al ta'mud sham kama tembel, don't stand there like an imbecile. And again, that's pretty universal. Then khafif. Khafif in Arabic means sloppily or casually. In Hebrew, we pretty much mean the same thing. It's sloppy or slapdash. Whenever someone does something not properly, in the stool is a khafif, they made a slapdash job of it. Universal. Yalla. Yalla is a very common expression in both Arabic and Hebrew. It means let's go, we're going to move on. It's an amalgam of ya and Allah, and everybody uses it. Nagla. Nagla is a word that kind of means like a truckload. In Arabic, it's actually nakla, and it means transport, but we use it in the sense of a truckload. So we'll take the bed in the next truckload when you're helping to move something from one place to another, and you're doing several trips. Each one of those trips is called a nagla. And again, pretty much, well, when I say everyone, it's most people. And then you have words like fispes. Now, this is actually from the Arabic, from fis to distract someone. In Hebrew, we've adopted it to mean just to miss. When you shoot at something and you miss, you say fispes. Somebody suggested in the Bible, it says, "Vayatel Shaul et hachanit b'David vayifasfes." It doesn't actually say that, but it could. And again, that's something that pretty much everyone uses. Then kef. Kef in Arabic, kaif is pleasure or satisfaction. In Hebrew, we use it in the sense of fun, like hayat kef b'brecha hayom. It was fun at the pool today. It's a word that everybody uses. Tafran. Tafran in Arabic means poor or penniless. In Hebrew, we need it in the sense of flat broke. Yossi Tafran, and Yossi is flat broke, he hasn't got a penny to his name. Pretty much universal. Then you've got a second demographic, which is what I would call married plus. So these are people who are no longer, just free and carefree bachelors and bachelorettes, but they have family, and so they have to tone down their language a little. But still, there are a lot of terms that they will use. So, for example, basta. In Arabic, Hebrew, it means a market stall. In Arabic, the word basat, it means to lay out the merchandise. So in Hebrew, you'll find people saying, "Ani sogeret habasta," I'm closing shop. Basically, whenever you're asking someone to do something and he's perhaps at work, whatever, he says, "No, you know what? I'm closing shop, and sogeret habasta. Ask me tomorrow." And this is something that people, young adults, up to the age of say retirement, might say, and afterwards maybe not so much. Then you have a word like mastul. Mastul in Arabic, satal means bucket, but in Hebrew we use it in the sense of someone who's stoned or not functioning. Like aniti mastul mirova yafut, I was zonked out of sheer fatigue. That's something which, as I said, young adults pretty much, once one gets to about middle age, perhaps one doesn't use it so much. Then there's a very common expression, dir balak. Dir balak means, in Arabic, it actually means place your heart, pay attention. But in Hebrew, we use it in the sense of God help you, if you do that. So someone would say, Ani mazhir otchem, okay? Dir balak, I'm warning you, okay? God help you. That's an expression which is pretty universal. Then you have frecha. In Arabic, faricha is actually a chick, but in Hebrew, we use it in the sense of floozy. So, with that dress, she looks like a white floozy. That's something which is pretty universal. Inshallah. Inshallah is actually Arabic, section 3 words. It's inshallah, which means if God wills it. In Hebrew, we use it in the sense of just all being well. The religious Jews would probably say Yirtzeh Hashem. So the typical expression would be Nitreh b'yom shishi, inshallah, see you on Friday, all being well. Ironically, this is something which Ashkenazis are more likely to say, and in an ironic form, rather than Mizrahim. And it's very important not to say this in the presence of religious Jews, because they might take offense. So it's something which you'll only see very, very, in very specific context. Mabsut. Mabsut is a very common word, meaning happy, pleased as punch. The kids were so happy there, you've no idea. Very common. Pretty much everyone uses it. Malyan. Malyan in Arabic actually means full, but in Hebrew we've adopted it to mean a millionaire or a million, because it sounds vaguely similar. And so in Hebrew we might say al-bahur zeh malyan, that guy is a millionaire. Or Ayusha Malyan Talafim Tufim, there was like a zillion spectators there. So that's something which, common word, but actually used more by youngsters, young adults and youngsters rather than respectable adults. Sachten. Sachten is an interesting word because it's one of those words that actually got fairly corrupted in the meaning. In Arabic, it actually means double health to you. So you would say something, you would say that, to someone when you're wishing them double health. It's a bit like the Hebrew l'chaim. But in Hebrew, it's taken on the meaning of, hey, look at you, or congratulations. And so you might, if someone's bought a new car, you might say to them, Sachten al ha'oto ha'chadash, congratulations on the new car. So that kind of amuses Arabs when they see Israelis using it in that sense. And that's something which is used by most adults, and it's fairly common. Sahbak is another example of a slight corruption. In Arabic, it actually means your friend, male, masculine, singular. Some of you may remember from the British Raj that there's the word sahib, and that's kind of from the same word. It means friend, but it can also mean master. And in Hebrew, the word sahbak has come to take the meaning of actual best buddy. So you might say, Hu v'ani sahbakim ma'azatzava. So he and I are best buddies since the army. That's something which is something that young adults up to say middle age might say. And you have fadicha. Fadicha is an embarrassing boo-boo. In Arabic, it actually means an outrage or a scandal. But in Hebrew, we mean it in the sense of something which is like an embarrassing mistake. So, al taseh fadichot, tov, dir balak, no screw-ups, okay? God help you. I actually have an entire blog, which I call al-fadich, which means basically don't make boo-boos, which I write for my Israeli clients on showing them what mistakes not to make in English when they use English or foreign languages. A similar word is fashla. Fashla, again, means a mistake. In Arabic, it actually means failure. In Hebrew, it's a serious mistake. So, al taseh fashlot, okay, and don't make any serious mistakes. Finjan. Finjan is an example of another corruption. This is interesting because what I suspect happened is that in the early days of the Zionist settlers, when they were visiting, say, local Arab sheikhs or their neighbors, and the Arabs would invite them in for coffee, they pour them the coffee in little cups. And a coffee cup in Arabic is called a finjan. But in Hebrew, for some reason, they misunderstood it to mean the actual coffee pot. And so when in Hebrew the word finjan is used, we mean it in the sense of the pot that you actually brew the coffee in. So we might say, he makes coffee in a finjan the proper way, not realizing that the word finjan actually means a coffee cup, not actually the coffee pot. Now here's an interesting one. When I was studying in London way back when, there was a Syrian guy who was studying with me. This is not what he looked like, but let's just use this for an example. His name was Mahmoud, and when he discovered that I told him that we use Arabic in our slang, he was fascinated, and he asked me to give him some examples, and I gave him the examples that I've told you already. But one of the words I told him about, I mentioned, was tizinabi, and when I said tizinabi, he kind of blushed, and he said, "You say tizanabi?" And I say, "Yeah." And he says, "You realize that means the backside of the prophet?" And then I was embarrassed, because when I thought about it, yes, I realized that's what it meant. But we don't mean it in that sense. When we say it in Hebrew, we just mean it in the sense of it's the back of beyond. It's in the sticks. So, something is bitizinabi. Something is way off there. But since it's offensive to Muslims, it's something that you have to be careful about using to an Arabic or suddenly to a Muslim person. And then here's a funny one. I don't know how many of you speak Russian, but most Israelis think that the word kibinimat is actually Arabic as well. In fact, it's Russian, and it's a very rude expression. We use it very, very, in a very mild manner of simply like damn, kibinimat, just as we would say damn in English. Or would you say it in the sense of to hell, like lech kibinimat, go to hell. But in Russian, it means doing something unmentionable to your mother. So when I asked Mahmoud this, he had no idea what I was talking about. And he said, well, maybe it's just a Palestinian thing, because we don't use that in Syria. So this is something which you'll find everybody pretty much is using. Again, this is offensive to Russians, so don't say it in the presence of Russians. Okay, moving on. Demographic number 3, the young and the restless. In Hebrew, the young and the restless is tzeirim chasrei manoach. But the joke is that it actually is tzeirim chasrei moach, or the young and the brainless. At any rate, there's a whole group of words that young adults will use, but once you get into middle age, it's not considered, it just seems a little odd to use. One of them is alek. Alek actually comes from the Arabic galik, which means so you say. In Hebrew, we use it in the sense of as if or allegedly, like he says that he's an expert. That's what he says. This is something which young adults will use, but once you get to the age of 40 or so, it's considered a little odd. Then you have just the word abu. Now, abu in Arabic, Hebrew means, well, actually in Arabic, it means father of. So, for example, abul banat is someone who's a father of girls, someone who only has girls. In Hebrew, we use it in a variety of expressions. So, for example, ba'abu abua literally means by the father of the father, but we mean it in the sense of and how, right? By the way, in Arabic, there is no word just Arabic. There is no name Abu by itself. You'll see that in many Western films or stories. You'll see someone who is. They talk about someone in an Arabic country, an Arab country, whose name is Abu. That just doesn't make sense. It's like calling someone father of. It's always Abu something. It's the father of something. Basa. Basa is a common term. It means bummer. Is a basa? What a bummer. Something which young adults use. Achla is the opposite. It means the sweetest. So in Hebrew, we use it in the sense of something great or excellent or awesome. Zoteta achla r'tza'a is something which I hope you'll say at the end of this. That was a great talk. Very common, but again, it's mostly young adults who use it. Here's another one. Anaref, it actually means I know, but when you use it in Hebrew with a question mark at the end, it means how the heck do I know? So someone asks you something fairly arcane, you say to them, Anaref, I don't know. What do you want from me? Asli. Asli means literally real, authentic, real deal. We usually say that about Arabic, Yemenite food when we're very appreciative, but we could use it in a borrowed form pretty much about anything. So you could say about like Vladimir Russi Asli. He's not a Jewish Russian. He's an actual Russian. Again, this is something which pretty much only young adults will use, but it's fairly common. Darwin. Darwin is slightly going out of style, but it's actually from the Arabic dawawin, which is plural of diwan, which means office. And in Hebrew, we've taken it to mean pretense, someone who puts on airs, right? In the last 20 years or so, it's been increasingly taken over by a different borrowed word, which is posa, which is from the English to pose. But you'll still hear people say it occasionally. Then you'll have a word like dachka. Dachkot usually is actually plural. It means laughs. But in Hebrew, we use it in the sense of joking around, making fun, pranks. We sat around and had some laughs, usually at the expense of other people. Again, this is just pretty much young adults. Dugri. Dugri in Arabic means straight. In Hebrew, we use it in the sense of frankly or honest. I'll tell you straight, you've got no chance with her. So, Dugri, pretty much young adults, fairly common. Another common word is khalas. Khalas in Arabic means he finished. But in Hebrew, we use it in the sense of enough already, move on, Tov nu khalas, tavor ala. All right already, enough, move on. Young adults. Jama'a. In Arabic, it simply means group. You'll have heard of in the news about organizations in, say, Sudan or Egypt or maybe Indonesia called Al-Jamaa Islamiyah. It simply means the Muslim gang, the Muslim group. In Hebrew, we use it in the sense of the gang, but again, it's only young adults would say this, like we're meeting the whole group, the whole gang. Just young people. Rasmi. Rasmi, in Arabic, it means official. In Hebrew, we've borrowed it. The actual word in Hebrew is rishmi, but we sometimes use the Arabic word just to sort of as a variation. So someone might say that something was a hobby, but now it's officially a business. Again, that's something which young people say, not so much others. Rabbak. Rabbak actually is Arabic for Riboncha, your Lord. In Hebrew, we use it in the sense of, come on, like, B'chiyat Rabbak, ta'aseh tova, come on, do me a favor. So fairly common. But again, it's usually just youngsters. Sababa. Sababa in Arabic, it means passionate love and yearning, which I actually didn't know until I researched this talk. In colloquial Arabic, it actually means excellent and okay, and that's how we've accepted it in Hebrew. So you ask someone, Echolech shama, sababa. How is it going over there? Excellent. Very common, but mostly used by youngsters. Wallah. Wallah is another common expression. It literally means by God. In Hebrew, we use it in the sense of honest to God, or seriously. So someone might say, "Ani asiti kacha v'kacha," and the other person will say, "Wallah," seriously, and the other guy will say, "Wallah," that's honest to God. So it means both things. Again, that's pretty much only youngsters up to the age of 35, 40. And then you've got your fourth demographic, which is dude talk. Dude talk is language which, if you're not young and of a particular background, you shouldn't be saying this. It's only between themselves. It's like it's very much in-crowd kind of language. First, you've got words like akbar, which actually means greater. So when you hear the Arabic expression "God is great," it's actually God is greater. And in Hebrew, we use it in the sense of someone who's just a hell of a guy, like akbar gever, something superlative. Pretty much just guys in their late teens and 20s usually. Then you have achui. Achui means my brother in Arabic. In Hebrew, we use it in the sense of bro, but we'll also use it in expressions like achu shalmuta, which actually means brother of the whore, but in Canadian, we might call it skuku. Achul manyuki literally means brother of the badass, but in Hebrew, we use it in the sense of amazing. Again, pretty much just young guys will say this. Janana. Janana in Arabic means insanity. Some of you may have heard the word majnoon, which means someone who's crazy. In Hebrew, we use it in the sense of nuts, but specifically when someone makes you nuts. So tafsikim zata mabilita janana, it means cut that out, you're making me nuts. Only young guys say this. Jora. Jora literally means sewage. We use it in the borrowed sense of shut your pie hole, so stomp the jora, shut your mouth. Just youngsters say that. Ma'ruf. Ma'ruf in Arabic literally means well known or a favor. We use it in the sense of favor. So ta'asali ma'ruf, akhi, and do me a favor, bro. And only youngsters say that. And then you have a word like jaf, which is actually Arabic, but only from a specific part of the Palestinians. So Palestinians have different regional dialects, and this is only the Zoram Shulash, an area that we call the Zoram Shulash, which is actually the area adjoining the West Bank. It's that sort of area where instead of saying kaf, they say chaf. We've borrowed in a sense of what it means, a hand, but we use it in the sense of five, like, tell me chaf, give me five. We also use the expression chafcha, which means a slap upside your head. I'll smack you upside your head. Only youngsters will say that. Then you have yani. Yani in Arabic and borrowed Hebrew means that's to say or like. I said to him, like, get out of my sight. Get out of my face. Only young people, particularly of a particular community, will say that. When I came back from London in 95, after about 12, 13 years in London, I said that once to an operator, and she just giggled, because someone like me is not supposed to say that sort of thing. Yinal Rabbak. Yinal Rabbak is actually a corruption. In Arabic, it's Yilan Abuk, which means may your father be damned. But in Hebrew, it's got switched around, so we actually say Yinal instead of Yilan. And we need it in the sense of do something bad to your father. Again, it's something which only youngsters will say. Yinal Abuk. Then you have swear words, which I'm sure you were waiting for. My wife was actually encouraging me to give a whole list of them, but I'm going to tell you just two because it's embarrassing and I don't want to I don't want you to get any bad reputation. But the two most common ones are kus achtak, which means your sister's private parts, and kus ammak, which means your mother's private parts. Pretty much everybody says this, but you have to be very careful where you say it because there's no going back from that. And there's a whole bunch of more. I could write a book, and I probably shall, like Chantarish and Buchta and Zift and Neon Leon and so on, which if any of you are interested, I will, if you send me your name and so forth, and if I ever do write that book, I'll be happy to tell you about it so you can buy it. But just a warning, although I've taught you all these words, don't try this at home, okay? At least not in Israel. When Israelis say it, it's fine. And as I said, there's a specific demographic for each type of word. But if you're not a native Hebrew speaker, it sounds really funny. It really just odd when someone who's a foreigner says it. I mean, I'm teaching you these things so that you know them, have a passive knowledge, but don't try and use it yourself because it'll just look funny. And what should we expect in the future? Well, Israel is going through a very interesting transition at the moment. Increasingly in the mainstream, you're seeing more and more awareness of the fact that the demographics are changing. The Arabic, the Arabs and the Orthodox populations are growing in percentage terms. And there are interesting statistics, like for the fact that the most common name in Israel is not any Hebrew name that you might think, but it's actually Muhammad. You're seeing more and more Arab-Israeli artists featuring in articles on art in Israel. And as a translator, I get to see a lot of these, and I also see increasingly references in the literature of sociology papers and so forth that they have to take into account that some of the research sample, some of the research population, it should be Arabic or Arab Israelis, and it's not always taken into account. Increasingly, you're seeing advertising both in Hebrew and Arabic. And you're seeing graphic artists beginning to make fonts which are slightly Arabized or completely combinations between Hebrew and Arabic. You're having Jewish and Arab kids spontaneously beginning to get together and teach each other's languages. The first Druze presenter on a primetime TV came on in 2017. These are all trends which are showing that there's a growing change in the use of Arabic in the population. Tel Aviv municipality in Ramadan puts out great billboards wishing happy Ramadan or blessed Ramadan to the Muslim Arab residents of the city. And you're beginning to see a small but growing trend of intermarriages between Israelis or Jewish Israelis and Arabs. Like this celebrity couple, which is Tzachi Levi and Lucia Arish, were both well-known Arabs, well-known performers. Israeli pop music has changed from some.
פעם היו לשם ותארים נדירים, פעם המלך
יש לי ארץ החלב נוגע בדבש.
So that's part of the trend. So what will happen in the future? Well, I would think that slowly but surely the command of Arabic amongst Jews in Israel will grow in the coming decades to perhaps 50% of the levels that it was at the start of the state in 1948, and who knows, maybe even more than that. There are other trends. It's not all about Arabization. What's interesting in the last 20 years is that the Hebrew slang has actually taken on a lot of native Hebrew expressions like en, baramot, chaval al hazman, nitzinu, hores, mapil, en matzav, yesh matzav, tergia. I'm not even going to translate these to you, just for you to know that it's not all about Arabic, but this is just one of the trends. And not to mention the fact there's a whole vocabulary of slang from the army, which people learn in the army and which sometimes goes over to civilian life. So there are various types of Hebrew which, again, are not part of the official curriculum, but they exist and they are part of the everyday life. I actually wrote an entire Arabic army slang version of the Book of Job called Jobnik, way back when I was in the army, and it comprises almost entirely of military slang. So these are things that you should be aware of. Hebrew is more than what you see in the Hebrew HSL books. And if you're interested in further reading, here are a few links that you can look at. I'm sure that Marilyn and the others can post to you in due course. And thanks for watching.